Greetings, you delightful fiends. It's Ding Dong Darkness time yet again. And you know what? I felt like taking another trip to the movies. And I also know a lot of listeners out there really love the movie discussions here, especially when my buddy Josh from Press Play and Scream is along for the ride. So welcome back to the show, Josh.
Thank you so much. I hope your listeners are not completely sick of my voice by now.
Never. I think if anything, they had said they really loved the discussion with Apocalypse Now. They learned so much. And yeah, I think they really love hearing us nerd out to movies. So we're just giving the people what they want.
Well, I'm all about pandering. So by all means, yes.
Well, last time we took a long, winding, bloody journey up a river in Vietnam into Cambodia with our dive into Apocalypse Now. But this time, we're taking a really significant shift in both time and place, because in 2022, a movie called The Banshees of Inisherin, directed by Martin McDonagh and starring Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson, was released to critical acclaim. But more than a decade before that, in 2008, McDonagh, Farrell, and Gleeson also teamed up for another movie called In Bruges. And we figured we cannot talk about one without talking about the other. So that's what we're going to do today. And we didn't actually do any pre-production discussion here, but I don't know how you're feeling about this, Josh, but should we start with Bruges and kind of go to Banshees or dovetail it? How are you feeling?
I think you got to start with In Bruges because these really are bookends.
They are.
I mean, it's you can make sense of the second without the first, but to understand the flow from the first to the second, I would definitely start with In Bruges. Absolutely.
Literal bookends. In Bruges was McDonagh's first feature film, and in Banshees of Inisherin is his most recent. But McDonagh himself has been around a long time as a playwright. He didn't really get his start in filmmaking until his late 30s with In Bruges, but all throughout the 2000s and before that, he'd been making a lot of splash in the theater scene. Known as kind of like a brash, wild guy, and he does this sort of in-your-face kind of theater. He brings a lot of these sort of like brutal sensibilities to the stage, which I guess apparently makes him a bit of a controversial figure. I'm not a theater kid, so I can't speak a lot to that, and I don't know how much you know about any of that either.
Well, first of all, and we'll probably be touching on this here and there over the course of the conversation, but as you said, we previously, the last time, discussed Apocalypse Now, and there's more in common with this guy's oeuvre and that than one might think looking at it, in the sense that, first of all, there is a kind of cruel poetry.
Yes.
So there is, and especially from an Irishman, let's face it. I mean,
yeah, very much.
There's this, this beauty and this viscera at the same time, and this sort of dark moodiness to it that fuels it. And it's not surprising. It shouldn't come to any one as a surprise that McDonagh was a playwright, because there are certain writers. I mean, there are writers who are good at dialogue, and then there are writers who treat dialogue as rhythm and music and a kind of symphony. And there's a huge difference between the two. And again, you even get a lot of the more brutal playwrights who are able to bridge that. David Mamet comes immediately to mind.
That was my first thing too, my first thought.
Yeah, because there's a similarity to a certain degree in sensibilities of how these characters talk to each other and relate to each other. It's not hard, for example, to read something like American Buffalo and see how that and those character dynamics would feed into McDonagh's work. So, yeah, absolutely. And in reading his script, because I tried something new, as I told you, while I was rewatching this stuff, I actually had the screenplay in front of me.
I love that you did that, by the way.
Transcends. I think I'm going to do that from now on, because the script, for example, it's just so, it's so colorful and it's so descriptive, which are the perfect scripts. I love those scripts that really make the reader see the movie in their mind's eye.
Now, I'm curious, because I haven't looked at any of his screenplays. Is he kind of a screenwriter that puts a lot of scenery embellishment and description into it, or does he stick mainly to dialogue? Because I know some vary. Like if you read Denis Villeneuve's script for Dune, for instance, it's like reading a novel, whereas some of their screenplays are very stark and kind of bare. How would you describe that?
I would say that, a lot of screenwriters tend to, and I tend to, whenever I sit down to write a script, go a little overboard. And it's better to go overboard in terms of description than not, I feel, if only for the scene. McDonagh has, again, a poet's paintbrush in terms of a few brushstrokes that are perfectly tinted and perfectly placed will put you right into it. But he doesn't need to go on and on and on. He can do that succinctly. And to give you an example, this script, because you have the opening shots of Bruges by night and beautifully lit, and just the photography of it is magnificent.
Oh. And it's a fairy tale town. I mean, like Ray Fiennes says, a fucking fairy tale.
It's a fucking fairy tale town, isn't it? And the script describes those opening shots as, quote, otherworldly, gothic, and he specifically says the words, it could be any time in the last 500 years. It happens to be present day. I love it. Just the phrasing of that is so tight and so succinct, but it tells you so much, and then we hear the voiceover about this small-time hitman, of course, is Colin Farrell's character, who's screwed up some job, we don't know what yet, and he's talking about how he had to duck into a Burger King to wash up after, and he's being told to leave to London and go to Bruges. He didn't even know where Bruges was. And the modern and the petty and the scummy encroaches on this timeless beauty kind of immediately.
Yes. Yes. So beautifully said. I thought it was kind of a fascinating setting for something like this because of the different contrasts and the different things involved. I love that he said that it could take place anytime in the last 500 years, because one of the notes that I made as I was watching In Bruges again, I hadn't seen it really since it came out. I rewatched it a few days ago. My immediate thought was timeless. This is taking place anywhere. In a place like Bruges, it is, as quoted from Brendan Gleeson in the film, one of the most well-preserved medieval cities in the world. If you want to get an idea of what things looked like in the 1200s and that it's well-kept, yes, head over to Belgium and particularly visit Bruges. Beautiful canals. And, I personally would fucking love to be hanging out in Bruges if I fucked up a hit. My boss told me to go hang out. Somewhere to await further instructions, because that's what happens here. They tell Ray, played by Colin Farrell, he's sort of the young fuck up. He's very new to the game, and Brendan Gleeson plays sort of his older, more seasoned mentor. And so I guess we could go ahead and say, I mean, it's not quite revealed the extent of Ray's fuck up with this hit job that he was put on, but essentially, it comes a little bit later. He is supposed to kill a priest. He kills the priest, but in doing so, he accidentally shoots a little boy in the head who had been at the church. And this was a big, big mistake. And as we'll come to find out with this story, it's funny, in Apocalypse Now, we talked about how, this could feel like a morality tale, but it really doesn't. And it's kind of cool how they hid it under a bunch of layers. This is very much a morality tale.
You think so? Really?
I think it is, but I think it's done in such a way that it subverts a lot of morality tales, because we're talking about hitmen here. We're talking about guys who kill other guys. This is their job. So we're already starting off with quote unquote unlikable characters just given by virtue of what they do.
Sure.
But throughout it, we start to see room for redemption for both of them, right? And I feel like that's where the morality part comes in, because we really start to see, as the movie goes on, and the dynamic between Brendan Gleeson and Colin Farrell. Brendan Gleeson being, again, the older, wiser, he likes the culture, he likes the tours, he loves Bruges. Neither of them are aware of anything at this point in the beginning of the film, other than they need to hide out here and wait to hear from Harry, their boss, played by Ray Fiennes. We'll get to him more in a little bit.
Oh, we will.
Oh, yeah, I'm excited about that. But Colin, Ray, he hates it there. He is completely put off by it. He doesn't, it's a fucking boring, it's like, I'm not going to say the line because I'll just say there's a lot of words in this movie that, if we repeat them, then people get mad and whatever. So we won't, but we'll just say you don't come to a Martin McDonagh film and expect politically correct language or anything of the sort. His dialogue and the violence and the humor is all very coarse and entertaining, but it hits. The whole idea, though, being that as it moves on, we see like the old wise man and the idiot, but we start to get to know them a little better, and we start to get to know Ray a little better and see the things that he enjoys and see the things that he feels, the regret and the grief and the depression and the despair that he feels over killing a child. So all those things start to play with each other as the film goes on, and we see that he has a conscience. He's not just a killer. I mean, he's just kind of a hot-headed little dumbass, but he's more than that. So I think that's what I really love about it, is like you can do a morality tale like in the style of like a, I don't know, something from the 1600s, like maybe if she was virtuous she wouldn't have been murdered, like they did in sort of the old Penny Dreadfuls and early true crime stuff.
And we do now in slashers, let's face it.
Oh, for sure. Whereas here we have, you're just starting off at a different morality level in general, and we're working within those parameters. So that's one thing I found really interesting about the setup here.
And that is interesting, yeah. And I have definitely a lot to say about it, because I came from sort of a different, I guess I got a different view of it while I was watching it. Because
that's the beautiful thing.
Yeah, so much of McDonagh's work is about studies and contrasts, but especially in this movie. And especially, as you said, expressed by these two characters. Gleeson is patient. Farrell is antsy and petulant. Gleeson is mature and reasonable, while Farrell is churlish and hypersensitive. Gleeson's a man who might not necessarily, you called him an older, wiser man. I don't think he has wisdom.
I think he's calm. You're right, though. He's very calm. And I think maybe that's what makes him seem wise. Right. Yeah. Good point.
And he has a bit more perspective. Not a lot, but a little bit more than Farrell. He has more of an active interest in the world around him. Farrell is completely balled up in his own problems, and he's trapped in his own head. And again, we'll get into so much of this later, but that's part of what makes this and Inisherin perfect bookends, because the settings and the circumstances are different, but fundamentally you're going to see a version of these two characters later on. But you mentioned the priest and the little boy. I think it's important to mention narratively, it was a corrupt priest. He doesn't just go around blasting priests. But Farrell's whole delivery from the time we start this movie, which is after that's happened, his delivery and his physicality are that of a little boy. Mm-hmm. And we find out then that he killed the little boy. And that's not to say Farrell was functioning much more highly before that happened. He probably wasn't. But there's the notion that having done this terrible thing, he might be regressing to try to deal with it mentally to some more innocent version of himself that was maybe a mischievous ne'er-do-well, but wasn't a child killer. But,
right.
But the thing that you were talking about whether this is a morality play or not, that's what's interesting to me, because the biggest contrast of pretty much any McDonagh film that I've seen, at least, is the universal contrast that we are all living in this bewildering, mysterious, immense universe, which might or might not be completely uncaring to our circumstances. And all of us are meanwhile living these tiny yet seemingly complicated lives, and we're desperately trying to make sense of the vast gap between those two things.
Yes.
And we see these absurd coincidences, and they hint that maybe the universe isn't indifferent, but it's always a question mark. But yeah, we were talking about how Apocalypse Now is not a movie that moralizes. And I feel that that's the case in most of McDonagh's films, including this one. Like, a lot of people were pissed when they saw Three Billboards, because they were like, oh, we don't need to humanize a racist asshole who was played by Sam Rockwell, who's always brilliant. And I think, for example, like, yeah, you said we're starting off with a couple of hitmen, and one of them whacked a kid, even though it was an accident. Like, we need to humanize the worst villains among us, because they don't come from nowhere. They're not demons from another dimension. We don't need to be on their side, but It would be good to get a good look at them beyond our initial perceptions of them. And McDonagh's all over that. But
yeah.
So, like, his movies, I don't think really, including this one, tell you what to think or really tell you how to feel about what's going on. They exist within something that's larger than any individual concerns of that. And again, that's like Apocalypse Now. It's not, there's no heroes and villains to speak of in this story. Like Harry is a villainous creature to a certain degree. But even then, I mean, it's not, quite so black and white as all that, especially in the I love you scene at the end. It's about people and things happen to them and they react to those things in a very realistic response. And they're flailing. All of his characters are flailing and trying to figure it out and navigate it while they combat existential dread.
I've seen people compare this movie or the setting of this film as sort of akin to a sort of purgatory. A lot of analysis will say you're sitting here to await judgment, and then you get to kind of stew in your own thoughts and your reflections and kind of your actions and what led you here.
Which is a very medieval concept, by the way.
Very much so. And through the course of this, and this is one thing I really love about it, is you come right off the bat, Colin Farrell's character, he exudes like you said, a very childlike demeanor. And I really love that you linked that to a possible regression due to his action. I think that's a very good point. He has a sullen, slouchy, spoiled kid posture whenever they're in the museum, for instance. Or is it the church? I can't remember. When they were in the museum, that actually managed to catch Ray's interest because there were a few interesting paintings there. And one of them in particular was The Last Judgment by Hieronymus Bosch, which is a 3-panel triptych that depicts sort of the final judgment of Jesus Christ. Like he's above, and then there's all this sort of chaos that happens on the middle panel. And I think it's the left panel exhibits paradise and the right panel exhibits sort of like the worst of the worst, right? Outcome, I think it is. But people say that as he's evaluating this painting, it's very symbolic of him potentially thinking about his own judgment and what's going to happen to him. He's carrying the burden and this weight of what he has done to this child with him into this town. And so those moments like provide like an opening of reflection for him. And I think it also is interesting the way that Ken, the name of the Brendan Gleeson character, the way he observes Ray in these moments too. Like I almost get the feeling that like in the very beginning, he just kind of rolled his eyes. He's like, oh God, this guy is just, just a dumbass. And so as they're hanging out together in purgatory, they start to, get to know each other a little better. And yeah, you see the fact that this guy is very deeply traumatized by what he has done. And, there are more moments to visit that. But that Hieronymus Bosch painting is, it's a really interesting study. I'll post a link to it in the show notes. I thought it was really neat that he used that to sort of reinforce the purgatory theme going on there. But another thing is going on at the time when these two are hanging out in this town, and that is a film is being made.
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm very glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a movie crew there, and there are a couple. Well, there's one particular actor that catches Ray's attention. He is a dwarf named Jimmy, and because Ray is, again, he is not a gentleman. He is not a refined guy. He never will be. He might be a good guy deep down inside, but he's never going to be the kind of guy that'll use the right word to refer to someone. Let's just say that. But he's charmed by this little person. He just looks at him like he might look at a small child, essentially. And again, do you think that's related to, again, what he did when he shot the kid? Like, do you think he's trying to redeem himself by befriending this dwarf? I mean, do you think that there's a link there, or is that something else entirely?
Well, first of all, from a filmmaking perspective, it's all linked. I mean, it's all just these beautiful, beautiful wheels within wheels, like the triptych, like you were talking about, definitely. Which, by the way, like when Ray's looking at it, and by the way, I'm going to go back and forth between the actor's name and the character's name because
same. It's hard.
Usually can't remember the character's name, so when he's looking at it, even the look on his face, you're right, it got his attention when he was, as bored in this sort of museum setting as most small boys would be, who had no interest in that. Bosch will arrest the eye of pretty much anyone, but especially a kid who has sort of morbid inclinations to begin with.
Right.
So I don't think that he was looking at it and functioning on a high enough level to, make meaning, but on a subconscious level, it very clearly did because he was disturbed by it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And yes, I mean, again, we are in this setting where the medieval concept of weighing of souls and that sort of thing blends beautifully. Absolutely. Oh, and by the way, when we do see the scene, the flashback, where he kills the child by accident, and the child's waiting for confession.
Mm-hmm.
The child's got his sins written down.
Oh, God, that's that moment. Ugh.
And the written out sins are being moody, being bad at maths, being sad. And it's so easy to imagine that those were Ray's sins when he was growing up, and they still are.
Right.
If you can call them sins. But one thing, I won't forgive myself if I don't go off on this tangent, because there's a very mean and petulant and quite racist dwarf actor, part of this fake film production that's being done in Bruges, which, I mean, there's so much to unpack with the whole movie set thing to begin with, in a sense
Absolutely.
of unreality, of being able to sort of detach from it all, which is what Ray wants to do. But also, like, the dwarf is very truculent about being part of this whole situation. And he talks about how the reason he's there is that he's supposed to be part of a dream sequence. And I don't know how many people out there listening to this saw a movie called Living in Oblivion. It was back in the early 90s. It's huge cast that starred young Steve Buscemi as this young indie filmmaker who's trying to make his masterpiece, and he's shooting a dream sequence, and so he's got a dwarf in it. And of course, who's playing the dwarf? Peter Dinklage is playing the dwarf back way before he had any kind of career. Like,
I love Peter Dinklage.
Yeah, and he, he just suddenly explodes in the middle of, and rightfully so, in the middle of this shoot. And he just says, "Oh, isn't this great? Yeah, I'm only in this because it's a dream sequence, and you have to have a dwarf in a dream sequence so that it's, just so surreal. Oh my goodness, why is that person of a different proportion? This must be some kind of a dream. Listen, motherfucker, have you ever dreamed about a dwarf? I'm a dwarf, and I don't dream about dwarves."
Right.
And he stomps off the set, and it had me even back then just like rolling on the floor. So, like, I was kind of wondering whether this was maybe a specific nod to that, or if it was just sort of reached independently. But I mean, I can see why, I don't get the racism thing, obviously.
I'm glad you brought that up about the sort of the other movie reference and what he said, because apparently after Colin kills the priest, and they're talking about it later on, like, as to why. And I think he'd like assumed it was because of, pedophilia that he like killed him. But he was like, no, it's because of a bad land deal that he was involved in with someone else. But that was actually a reference to another movie where a priest was assassinated because he was involved in some crooked land deal. And I have to go and look it up to be sure. But McDonagh definitely likes to slip those little references in the background, like almost like Easter eggs.
You get some great crooked priest gets killed. Like, you get, like, Sin City's got a great one. Road to Perdition, I think you got similar. So that's, that is a fun little detour of the fact that, like, the Catholic Church has its own rackets going on.
Exactly. I mean, is anybody surprised if a priest turns up on someone's hit list? It's almost like, oh, of course he did. Any number of reasons, just grab one.
Speaking of rackets, of course, we got to talk about Ray Fiennes.
Dear God.
You get some great British gangsters, like, with just these manic, explosive, fucking rabid dogs. They're scary and colorful, and they're whimsically dangerous. And, we always talk about the Italian-American mafia flicks. I'll watch those all day, but we never give credit to, like, these hardcore, memorable gang lords. Like, you've got Richard Burton in Villain in 1971. You've got Bob Hoskins in The Long Good Friday. Even Bricktop in Snatch, which is played a little bit for laughs, but kind of not. Don Logan in Sexy Beast, which was one of the scariest fucking people you've ever seen.
So good. So good.
And they're funny, like they're funny because they're so unhinged, and the dialogue that's assigned to them is hilarious, but it's also
Yeah.
fun. And so Fiennes belongs in that pantheon easily. He's hideously funny, and he's the most brutally petty man walking the planet Earth. And yet he has this, and speaking of morality, he has this quote unquote extreme moral code, and it makes sense to him.
That's the thing. And then when I said too, like it's like a subversion in its own way of the trope, because everybody has a code of some kind, or there is a backbone of a code or a system of honor and principle that runs through the middle of this thing. And what his is, of course, is
don't kill kids.
Don't kill kids.
And again, speaking of morality, this man is clearly some kind of a monster on two legs. And yet he is fine with himself because he can tell himself that, at least like all gangsters, from Tony Soprano on back to, Corleone and even further, they can tell themselves, oh yeah, well, sure, I steal and I kill people and I this and I that, but I do have a code. There's things I won't do, and that makes me not such a bad person.
Like whatever it takes for you to sleep at night.
Yeah.
Of course, Ray Fiennes, the first encounter we have with him is through a voiceover. Well, it may not be it really is the real encounter we have with him. It's a voiceover that he does when they're reading a message that he left for them, for the boys in their hotel room, whenever they weren't there, whenever he tried to call. Because for whatever reason, we don't do cell phones in this particular universe, part of the universe.
It was '08. There were probably a lot of good reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
Not new really, but enough new that they'd probably be a little panicked about talking.
Might be a little risky, So yeah, he leaves a note, and every third word is fuck. And his accent, he's doing the classic Liverpool, like thick, very thick accent here, and basically not happy that he wasn't able to reach them, because the first night that they go out, I think they went out to see the town. That's when they saw the movie set. And of course, that's when Colin Farrell's character meets Chloe.
Yes.
The sort of young woman. He's immediately attracted to her. And of course, she becomes a bit of a love interest. She's played by Clemence Posey. I'm probably pronouncing her name wrong. It's very French. It has all these accents. I don't know French. So you will know her as Fleur Delacour in the Harry Potter movies. And, she's been in
out of here. That was her.
Yeah, that was her. Shit. Yeah. She's a really interesting character. She's this immediately kind of beautiful, interesting. She hits it right off with him, when she meets him kind of near the movie set. And
she's good at being mysterious.
Very mysterious, very interesting sense of humor, very alluring. And she gives him her number. She walks out. Well, she really just throws a card behind her as she's walking away. That's her way of giving a phone number. And then they hook up for a date later. So that gives Ray reason to kind of like, all right, this place sucks, but hey, I got a date and there's something interesting going on here. So he's occupied, at least. He's not nearly as surly as he was when he first arrived.
Well, a few things about that. And before I even go into that, just one more, we'll get in and out of Harry, obviously, for the rest of it. But I did want to mention one more thing about Harry, because you did say something to this effect. He does have something in common with Ray, to some degree. Both of them are grown-up children. They're different types of children, but they have an idea of who they feel they should be, to a point where they're willing to kill themselves if they can't live up to that, since they live in worlds of complete extremes and have zero impulse control.
Yes. Yes.
But
that's a beautiful summation of both of those characters. Yeah.
But the date, I mean, and this is an interesting subplot, with Chloe and the whole thing, is something that struck me while I was rewatching this. Because you're right, to some degree, this is taking Ray out of his deeper levels of misery, because I think through force of habit, a guy like Ray, a guy like a lot of us, if we see a chance at romance, we're going to kind of, naturally reach out for it, no matter what happened to be at a given moment. It's just sort of impulse. Certainly for somebody like him. If a guy like him, sees a hot chick, he's going to try to mac on. I think that's kind of, even if he's terribly out of his league intellectually, which she clearly is.
Yeah.
But while he's getting ready for the date and he's looking in the mirror, what struck me is we see his face while he's doing this. And maybe, depending on our individual levels of mental illness, we might have seen that look on our own faces a time or two while we're preparing for a date, where we stop and remember who the fuck we are and say, what am I doing?
Right.
What difference does it make what I'm wearing, what my hair looks like, how charming I can act? I'm a worthless piece of shit. I just shot and killed a kid. I'm a bad person. Why should I bother with any of this shit?
Mm-hmm.
But he goes anyway, because again, it's kind of instinct.
Yeah.
And to seek people out who might fill the hole, even if we don't feel like we're worthy of them. And so they're at dinner and, you know, verbally sort of parrying and thrusting. And again, obviously, she's got him on the ropes for most of it.
Yes.
And then Zjelzko Ivanek shows up at the next table as the irate diner. He shows up in the strangest places, and he's
like everybody's favorite Russian villain or second favorite Russian villain. I don't know.
Or villain on Law and Order, or lawyer on Law and Order, or you know,
right.
Usually he'll show up as some either fussy or sinister man, or both.
Mm-hmm.
And I love him as a character.
Oh, he's great. Yeah.
But I mean, it was just like, what the? As always, Zjelzko, what the fuck are you doing here? And why are you in Bruges? In Bruges? And more often than not, just like this time, it's pretty satisfying to see him get punched out.
Oh, I loved it too, because it should be noted as well that, you know, while they're there, because Chloe, she was smoking in the restaurant and it was bothering them apparently. And so, of course, she gets up and leaves. And he comments and says some shit to get his the guy at their table, and you know, talks about, you know, how I don't need to die for your fucking arrogance because of the secondhand smoke and all this. And of course, Colin Farrell thinks that they are American because they're using very neutral accents.
And because it would make sense, because he's already had with the three Americans at the tower, and like basically, I mean, these people are just determined to be so self-absorbed and ruin absolutely every encounter. And it bears mentioning, by the way, that it is the smoking section. He even
says it is
the smoking section. But like most pricks who we would assume to be American, Zjelzko just wants to be an asshole and make things about himself for no reason. And so finding out he's Canadian later, that was mind-blowing.
That was, yeah, and I loved it, though, when Colin Farrell punched him out. He's like, that's for John Lennon, you fucking yank. I was like... It just died. I'm like, oh, so yeah, when I too found out that the guy was Canadian, I was like, oh shit. You just, you know, like that's probably happened to a number of Canadians traveling abroad. People think they're American and they get treated like shit. Sorry, Canadian friends. It happens, but yeah, so that incident doesn't go unanswered. Of course, we'll get to that later. Yeah. Now, I can't remember, because while the date is going on, Brendan Gleeson's character, Ken, he's back at the hotel. He gets the call from Harry, finally, and talks to him, and Harry tells him that he has to kill Ray.
Yes.
Because of what happened with the kid. And the look on Gleeson's face during this is he's crushed, but he knew. I don't think he was surprised.
I think we all knew on some level.
Right.
The way that it was structured seemed a little bit like that was going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, he talks about, you know, the conversation's kind of funny because, you know, he's telling Harry how much he's liking the town and, you know, the culture and all this. And he's like, but I don't think Ray's getting anything out of it, though. He thinks it's, you know, it's really not him. And
what do you mean he's not getting anything out of it? How can he not get anything out of it? It's a fucking beautiful town. It's a magical town. It's a fucking fairy tale town. What are you telling me? You can't get anything out of it. What the fuck does that mean? What the fuck are you saying to me? I mean, like, these great gangster bulldogs who will just gnaw and chew and bark at you, and and we don't see his face till later. But even from you feel like this is a creature that will tear your face off if you say the wrong thing, and just the way that Ken like reverses track immediately, like, oh no, well, I mean, of course he likes it, he loves it. I just sort of must have misspoke.
Yeah. Because, I mean, if you insult or don't like Bruges as much as he loves Bruges, and clearly you don't like him because this is apparently his favorite motherfucking place on earth. Bruges is Harry's version of Disneyland. Like, so of course, when he's thinking, I'm going to send these two kids over here to hang out while I, set up their deaths, he picks this place instead of, I think it was Colin Farrell later on said, why couldn't it have been the Bahamas or something like that? No, he picks this medieval town in the middle of Europe. And then, of course, it was like almost an offhand line by Brendan Gleeson, just said it was cheaper.
Right.
So.
And the thing too is that like McDonagh has the perfect eye for psychopathy and how to write it and how to express it, and that is Harry absolutely, in terms of just
to a T.
There is no world outside of this man's head.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like you said, if he likes something, then that must mean everyone likes something, because it's people are not really people to him. Everything is only an extension of himself. I mean, it's terrifying.
Did you ever watch The Boys on Amazon? He's kind of like a Homelander in a sense, where he has that very domineering personality and very terrifying. When you push it, even in the most benign way, it sets him off. So yeah, this whole idea of like, he would be the kind of guy that would try to feed you something horrific, and disgusting, and say it's his favorite dish and dare you to not like it. You would be sitting there choking down fish entrails just to make this man not blow your brains out.
And the thing is, too, is that like most psychopaths, he has a very stark black and white view of the world that you can almost envy somebody with that level of clarity, never mind the fact that they're completely insane. But at least everything seems to make sense to them. Like, and it's my favorite scene in the movie was one that I saw the clip before I saw the movie, and thankfully it didn't really spoil anything for me. But it's the scene where Harry like comes to Bruges, deal with Kenny specifically, and they're sitting down together outside of the tower, and he's suicidal. Harry, he's suicidal. You're suicidal. I'm suicidal. Everyone's fucking suicidal. We don't keep going on about it, do we? Is he dead? Did he kill himself? He's not fucking suicidal, is he? And I mean, again, he's crazy, but
yeah,
it's kind of a poor man's existentialism if you listen to it. Like, it's like you start to feel like Henry Higgins listening to Alfred P. Doolittle. Like, well, when you really listen to this simple fellow, he actually has quite a lot to say, doesn't he?
That's so true. Oh my God. And speaking of, I'm glad you mentioned suicidal, because that's a good way to kind of segue into, I think, probably one of the most interesting scenes in this movie is it becomes quite clear because, he goes on his date. Now, remind me, the park scene. Mm-hmm. That's the one I'm getting into. But when the park scene happens, had we already had the cocaine binge with the dwarf in the hotel room? Okay.
That, I think, came quite a bit later. Yeah.
Okay, later. Okay. So we'll scratch that. But
because we won't get to that scene, because wow. But okay.
That's a scene. The scene in the park, as we have said before, given what Ray has done, he is under a lot of immense sort of like depression and despair over that. It's eating him up, that he killed a little boy. And then, he breaks down quite a few times actually over this throughout the film. And so it becomes very clear that he wants to end it. And of course, he's stuck in Bruges. He's stuck in fucking Bruges. He can't get out. And then he has to live with what he did. He doesn't see a good way out of this scenario. So at the same time, Ken has already received his orders from Harry to kill Ray. So he comes upon Ray sitting on a park bench. He's walking up behind him, and then all of a sudden Ray raises a pistol to his temple like he's about to kill himself. But while Brendan Gleeson is getting ready to point a gun as well, stops him from committing suicide, but also can't manage to kill him himself either. It's such an amazing, interesting intersection of, I can't let him kill himself, but I can't seem to kill him either. And then, of course, when Ray turns around and sees that there's a gun there, he's like, you were about to kill me. Oh, my God. So What a powerful, interesting moment that
The
was.
beautiful absurdity of moments
Yeah.
like those, which McDonagh
Yeah.
does so very, very well. And again, it's those moments, these like weird filaments that seem to kind of be too contrived to be mere coincidence, and yet that is what a coincidence is. That
Yeah.
again makes the large and the small kind of meet in those moments where you say, is everything happening for a reason, or is this
Mm-hmm.
all just senseless? And again, we never get answers to those questions. I love that. I love that.
An interesting Catholic thread running through it too, because this idea, and we'll see this come up again later, with trying to stop someone from killing themselves, because in Catholicism, it's the great mortal sin is taking your own life. And so if you are Catholic, that's a very strong thing. I don't know that any of these men consider themselves religious. Maybe Harry, on some weird abstract level, thinks he's a man of God. I don't know. That's kind of a maybe.
Possible. I could see him going to church every Sunday and saying that that's
Yeah.
a person, and then shooting somebody right after services. And
Like, it's almost more honorable to kill someone than to let them kill themselves. There's some weird thing there, you know?
I mean, I don't think it was even anything as advanced as that. I think it was just that gut reaction of a man who cares about another man.
He doesn't want him to die, like, at
He doesn't
all.
want
He
him to
didn't
die.
want to kill him.
He didn't want to pull the trigger, and he doesn't want him to pull the trigger. And would he have pulled the trigger? We don't know. He doesn't know. I mean,
Right.
he might not have been able to go through with it, and maybe Colin and Farrell wouldn't have been able to go through with it. But we'll never know, because those two moments collided in, again, a way that was
Right.
hilarious and sad at the same time.
There is so much dark humor, really, through all of McDonagh's work, and as we'll talk about in the next movie too. Is like, yeah, you find yourself laughing at some of the most uncomfortable moments, because he has the way of pulling back the wool and to find the absurdity lying right beneath, and he just hammers it, in the most beautiful way. And yeah, you're laughing, and at the same time you're like, should I be laughing? Fuck yeah, I'm laughing. I mean, you're having this conversation with yourself as you're watching the movie in almost every scene. And so with this one too, like, when we get to the moment where the guys have it out, they have their discussion. Ray knows that he is marked for death at this point, and that Ken is supposed to be doing it. There is, at this point, because Ray goes on his date, because that doesn't go right. I mean, they meet up again, they make out, like, in her hotel, or in her apartment or whatever, and her husband or partner breaks in and breaks up this entire date. And it's at this point that we learn that she and him, her husband, were robbing tourists. That's sort of like their gig.
Which again, I think as audience members to some degree who are functioning on a higher level than Ray is during the film, I think a lot of us instinctively sort of knew that probably some situation like that was going on.
He was like crestfallen, though. He was like, I should have known you wouldn't actually like a person like me. And well, come to find out, actually, she did like him, that it wasn't really a setup. But in the meantime, the whole moment of when he takes the gun that the guy had, and it's full of blanks, because he works on the movie set. Isn't that why it's full of blanks? It's a prop gun. And Colin Farrell fires it in the guy's face. Well, he ends up blinding him, because, as anybody works on, knows about movie sets, when a blank is not always a blank.
And here's the funny thing. Ray doesn't know that necessarily, but instinctively he kind of knows what a blank is going to do to a person's eye, even without having really had experience with that. And this is a little moment, this isn't kind of the punch in the restaurant, but certainly more this moment, where Ray is far from John Wick. But on the other hand, we do see that there's a reason why he does this for a living. This is one thing that when he doesn't need to think about it and just slips into the mode that he needs to slip into, he's quite capable. He's quite capable of disarming people and shooting them and beating them up. He's gifted at it.
Right.
He's clearly not gifted at anything else. And again, he's not some kung fu master, but he's got a natural gift for violence.
That's a really good point, because that's the thing we don't get. And Mark McDonagh has actually been known to say, I've watched a few interviews of his. GQ has a really good one. There's a few others, and he talks about how much he hates backstory. He fucking hates it. He doesn't like to put it in a movie. if he can avoid it. So he finds the most interesting ways to tell you something about a character without doing an info dump, which is always boring in any context, book or movie. And I love that you picked up on that and brought it up, because you're absolutely right. The way that he reveals character through action and dialogue is so great that you can already clearly envision how he might have become part of this sort of criminal underworld and what might have led him in that direction. You just already kind of know. You're never left by the end of the movie going, man, I wish he would have told us more about, what they were doing before they got there. You don't ever feel like you're missing out on it. Like, you really don't. It almost feels like if he did tell you, it'd be too overstuffed. Like, we don't need to know it. We just know who they are and why they are. And that's enough.
We're kind of encountering these characters the way we would encounter people in life, which is without any broader context of story or history, or we're just meant to get the impression of them from, as you say, from their actions. And again, we were just talking about Apocalypse Now, and sure, there are plenty of contexts in that movie where, info dumps and this and that done properly. We discussed the fact that, they're sort of necessary and done artfully. But as you say, if you cannot do that, which McDonagh is an absolute samurai at, just again, the brushstrokes, just the tiniest brushstrokes that evoke the largest picture.
Oh man, I wish as a writer myself, when I watch this stuff right here, is, taking from that what I can, because in writing books or screenplays, you and I've talked about this privately a lot, and probably why I would struggle with a script, because you do want to try to fill in as many details as you can when you're writing a story, when you're writing a book or a short story or whatever. And the fact that, he's able to illustrate all this. No, he's working in a visual medium, and that helps a lot as well. But you can also set that up in a book. So it's just really amazing from a storytelling standpoint. I would say that if you were looking to tell a very efficient, but also very highly emotionally evocative story with very strong, rich characters, watch these, because In Bruges is only 110 minutes long. It is short. It is a short movie. And I think Banshees is very similar. I don't think Banshees is much longer at all. You can double feature both of these movies and still, have time for dinner. And so I love that kind of storytelling. I mean, I love a long movie. I love a slow burn movie. I love all that. But I fucking love somebody who somehow manages to combine all the brilliant elements of storytelling in such an efficient way that it doesn't feel like you've been robbed at all. It's perfect. It is a fucking perfect bite of cinema and story. And we're not even done talking about it. So I'm going to continue on, because as we go through this, we got to talk about the dwarf in the hotel. Because after it's all out there that Ray knows that Harry wants him dead and that Ken has got to be the one to kill him and all this. And, they're having a few drinks of despair. And after the shooting that Ray had in the hotel room with the girl and her husband, he stole a bunch of drugs from their room. So he has like a pocket full of coke and weed, or no, acid or Molly, one of those. He's got a bunch of drugs.
It was acid.
Yeah. And so they decide to go and have a little drug binge in the hotel room of our dwarf friend, Jimmy. And that's where we learn that he is like a little miniature Charlie Manson. He's talking about a coming race war, and he's kind of not a great guy. I wonder a lot about that whole moment and what you think its purpose was in this movie.
Oh, you beat me to it, because I was going to ask you.
I mean, in a way, it's a great way to further calibrate. Again, I'm using the other M word, the moral one, for these characters, right? Because they're all hanging out in the hotel room. We've already established these are all a bunch of not great guys. But then the really poignant moment happens when our dwarf friend is talking about the race war that's coming, and he asks, what side would you fight on? And Colin Farrell is like, well, I'd fight with the blacks because, they kick more ass. Or he gives some reason that doesn't seem terribly racist, but probably, again, whatever,
How seriously can anyone expect?
Yeah, exactly. And then you get to Brendan Gleeson's character, and he is like, my wife was black, and she was shot by a white man in 1976. and I loved her very much. What side would I be on in this war? And Jimmy, he didn't have much to say. He was like, well, you'd have to weigh your options or something douchey, right? And Gleeson was like, fuck you, we're getting the fuck out of here. Fuck all this. And they get up and leave. And it is like a way to kind of reaffirm that regardless of where you are in the world or whatever station you're in or whatever, there's probably always going to be someone that you can measure yourself against and go, wow, I'm not as fucked up as that guy. I don't know.
Brings us right back to what we were saying about Harry. Brings us right back to the whole thing, because I think, yeah, you've kind of nailed it. That you have all of these rather base creatures in a room together.
Yeah.
And they're all just sort of groping each other and snorting just caterpillar-sized lines. Wonderful cocaine. And, and, you know, and yeah, just sort of living their sleaziest lives in that moment. But again, even a scumbag has a line. Punch down and say, but at least I'm not that person. And I guess you could say punch down literally.
Well, you know, yeah, and Ken is reminded who he is on the inside. I feel like Ken doesn't have the conflict in himself, I don't think, that Ray does. Like, Ken knows who he is, what he's done, and where he's going. I think he's the kind of the guy who's played the game long enough that, you know, he knows he's a killer. We never actually see him kill anyone in this movie, really. You know, we'll get to the end. Other than the person he kills at the end, we'll just say for now. But, you know, you could just look at him and know. Like, I believe it. He sells it beautifully.
Well, he's obviously very conflicted about who he is.
You think so? Absolutely.
I mean, you could see it, I think, in his eyes to a certain degree when they first got to Bruges, even when he didn't consciously maybe know why he had been sent there along with Ray. I think there was something in him that is, again, grasping at the sightseeing thing and trying to sort of imbue himself with knowledge and tell himself that he is something more and has a capability to exist on a higher level than what he actually is, which is somebody who slots people for money. And especially since by this point, what we've seen, as you've said, in the timeline is we've already had that park scene and the phone conversation before it. He is in no way comfortable with who he is. He kind of, I think, is functioning on a higher level than Ray is through all of this. But even then, even when they're having the conversation before all of that, and again, it's not an info dump. It's really just sort of more of a meandering two guys trying to communicate with each other and not quite about their previous instances of violence in their lives and how it doesn't make them bad people, but they're both trying to convince themselves.
I think that's you make some good points there. I feel like Colin, I always just see him as way more just because he's younger. And I think he's fighting something in his head. I think he thought, like, I just recently rewatched Unforgiven, which is, you know, one of my favorite westerns. I just did that last
night too.
Yes,
and for the 100,000th time, because I adore that movie and have it memorized. Yeah,
it's so good. We'll have to definitely bring that one on this show and talk about it, because it is like the kid that comes out, the Schofield kid, and he's talking about all these guys he's killed and all this shit he's done, and he wants to go and kill some cowboys that cut up a lady, and he gets to the point where it's time for him to fucking put up or shut up, and he does it, but he loses it. He can't do it. He realizes it's not for him. He never killed anyone before, but he put up a game. He made it look like he was more. I kind of liken him to Colin Farrell's character here, because he's young. He thinks he can do the job. He goes and does the job. Honestly, I think even if he hadn't killed the kid on accident, I think he'd still kind of be eaten up by it. I think he's beat up people. I think he's shot some people, or maybe he's, you know, done some violence against his own kind, you know, other gangsters or whatever he was into before he goes to that level. But once you become like a professional hitman, I think there's something like he wasn't cut out for that job. And I think that he probably would have always been, I don't think he ever would have been good at it. I don't think he's ever be the kind of guy that would have the nerve to become good at it. The way that Ken, I think, just by virtue of the fact that he got to where he is and as old as he is in this movie, and it's implied anyway that he's much more experienced and everything like that, that he found that level of acceptance of the job and has learned to just kind of like, he's resigned to it, I guess, in a certain way. So that's kind of where I get that line from, is that, whereas Colin is the kid that, I don't know, man. Do you think he would have ever become a good hitman? I just feel like he was never right for the job at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, a few things about that, because, yeah, you can definitely draw a straight line between him and the Schofield kid in the fact that both of them are a tremendous amount of bluster and a tremendous lack of self-awareness.
Yes.
And a lot more sensitivity than either one admit to.
Well, yeah, they were the guys that had it kicked out of them, right? When we talk about like toxic masculinity, the guys that have feelings that were beat out of them.
And so you can definitely draw that line, but Ken is no William Money. I mean, this guy,
no,
again, it's one of those things where the way McDonagh presents this, we've seen so many movies about hitmen. We have an idea in our heads about hitmen. Again, it's almost like the John Wick idea of...
Yeah, we recreate the archetype, right?
Yeah, they're so good at killing and they've killed this many people. And in the real world, and also to a certain degree in the world that McDonagh's presenting us with, again, mostly as described by that conversation they were having about previous violence, it's not really how that works. The way it works is that you get this job and maybe you have to, rough a guy up, and maybe this next time you have to shoot a guy in the back of the head, and then there's a time, like they said, maybe it's a self-defense thing, and then maybe this guy was in the game and he had to go. But ultimately, there's no continuity to it. There's just it's just assignments that they're given, just things that they have to do at any given moment. And sometimes it's collecting money, and maybe sometimes it's shooting a person, but there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no through line.
Yeah.
So I think that thinking about it in that context, it doesn't really work. But in terms of would he have been a good hitman? Well, what's a good hitman? We saw that, again, he has a capacity to execute violent acts in a way that preserves his own life and generally gets the job done. And that's a skill that not a ton of people have, probably even in that profession. He's pretty decent at that, it looked like. Mm-hmm. He's got reflexes and he's got instincts.
Yeah.
But that being said, eventually in a world like this that's not a Stallone movie, there's gonna be a stray bullet, because that's how bullets work.
Right.
Eventually a bullet will not just find its way into the person it's supposed to, but it's gonna, maybe a wild shot will go someplace else. So if it wasn't this kid, it was gonna be something eventually. And there's two kinds of guys. There's guys who can shrug that off and say, look, I'm a killer and I tried to do my thing and this other thing happened and that's not my fucking problem.
Collateral damage.
And they can go to the next thing and the next thing because they are psychopaths and they're those kind of people. This is not one of those people. He ultimately, the first time something like this happened, this whole avalanche that we see afterward would have happened. I mean, he was always going to be that person, if that's what you're asking.
God, the more we talk about this, the more I'm seeing other parallels in the Banshees of Inisherin. Because as Colin refers to that movie as watching the sort of disintegration of innocence, it does kind of do a similar thing in this, but you're starting from a different part of the spectrum of morality. We're not watching the disintegration of innocence, but what we are watching is maybe the disintegration of naivete, or, this illusion that you've built of, I'm going to become this hitman and do, hitman stuff. And it's just going to be like what I've always done on the streets, but I'm going to make more money and it's going to be a steady gig, yada, yada, yada. And then you come to find out that those jobs have consequences. Those actions have consequences. And if you can't accept that as part of the job, then that job's not for you. If you can't look at the fact that Timothy McVeigh blew up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, right across the street from a goddamn daycare center, that was his fucking point. But he was also like, he called those dead children collateral damage, and he was perfectly fucking fine with that. So there you have, someone who's willing to accept the consequences of those kinds of actions. And then you have someone like this who had like a preconceived notion about the job, and then the job got too real. And, and so that's where you find the humanity in him, though. I think that's why, even from the very beginning, when he's saying the R word and making fat jokes, I still felt there was redemption in him. And I feel like too, and honestly, Ken comes to that similar place because he decides what? He's going to try to help him get away. He tries to tell Ray, like, you have a chance here to make something of yourself. Get out of Bruges. Go on, leave, get out of here. And then I'll deal with Harry, essentially. Like, I'll deal with it. Just go. Just get the fuck out, right? That is literally Ken coming to that realization. And it also figures into this weird purgatory allegory that's happening here of like, he's willing to make a sacrifice to save what he thinks is salvageable in this murderous little Irish fucker. And he fucking does it. But again, what did I say when he punched the Canadian? Of course, that would come back to haunt, would it not?
Oh, yeah.
Ray gets on a train to leave Bruges and get the hell out. And he doesn't get very far until the train stops and a security guard or cop, comes along. And he's like, did you punch a Canadian? What? And then the dude, that he punched pops his little stupid head in. And Ray has to go back to Bruges to face charges for punching the Canadian in the restaurant. So it's almost like it kind of like brings that purgatory thing that, you could try to leave, but you can't get out. You're stuck here. Like Bruges is the holding place. Well, your fate is decided.
And it's also another one of those moments, again, where it seems like the universe is playing cat's cradle. Like, did this happen for a reason or did this happen for no reason at all?
Things leading to things leading to things, right? You could see the fucking thing, every action leading to that.
Does it prove that there is no God because of these random things are happening? Or does it prove that there is a God and he's some sort of sadist with a warped sense of humor to specifically, it's like the opener of Magnolia to a certain degree. Could these things possibly be this random, or are they this random because they're really that specific?
Yeah. Oh God, I love that you mentioned Magnolia. That's another one we'll talk about at some point. And while all this is happening, of course, more shit's going on because we jump to Ken's point of view and whatnot. Well, Harry has decided he's got to go to Bruges because after having the phone call and with Ken and, saying what he says and, the most famous probably associated gif from this movie is Rafe Fiennes slamming the handset down on the phone and fucking destroying it.
And then the wife comes in. It's an inanimate object. You're an inanimate fucking object.
Yes.
And then later, I'm sorry, I called you an inanimate object. I've been under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, exactly. So he's got to go to Bruges and deal with his two wayward employees. So yeah, he runs out. And so he's arriving in Bruges. And Ken, at this point, has already prepared himself for death, essentially. When he thought, when he got Ray out of town, that he had done his duty. And so he was ready to face the music. It was a very brave and selfless move.
And also, I think another reason that he did that was because back to what we were talking about earlier about, the definition of a good hitman, the hitman who's been in it longer. And, I think it's not that Ken is older because he's better at it or because again, I don't think there is any better at it. There's just, rough this guy up and then kill that guy. But I think really what it comes down to is he's just somebody who hasn't accidentally killed a kid yet. I mean, because honestly, if he had before now, probably something similar would have played out with him. He's clearly not the kind of person we're talking about who could call that collateral damage. And I think that he knows.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Point, I mean, he may as well just do this last good thing that he can do for this other man. And then just, quietly wrap this up now before this ends up becoming him.
I love your insights on his character. I really do, because I feel like, Colin Farrell kind of steals the show in his own way with this because he's the flashier personality. He's he's funny and crazy. And Brendan Gleeson's character is quieter. He's more understated. So you have to really, I would definitely say when I watch this movie again, I'm going to pay a lot more attention to his character specifically, because I feel like it is one of those that you have to really watch him
Oh,
to
yeah.
get a lot of those, because it could be easy to make certain assumptions about him. But you're absolutely right. If this had happened to him, he would absolutely be having a similar crisis. It would look a little different just because he's older. And there's what I'll refer to when we talk about the next movie, young despair versus age despair.
Yeah.
But for
Beautiful.
sure, it would be very, very similar. So, and again, this is just speaking again to how beautifully this film has been written. The fact that the action the almost seemingly meaningless action he took, punching the person in the restaurant, ended up bringing him back to town, which was supposed to be Brendan Gleeson's attempt to save this man's life. And now Harry is in town having the confrontation, and he's going to be dealing with Kim, but here's Ray. But he comes back, and he not only does that, he comes back with a sense of purpose and exuberance, and sort of like, I'm back, and he has the girl, and they have this really sweet moment, and it feels very hopeful. It is a really interesting crescendo for him. And then on the other side of it, we have Ken and Harry. And what is it like? They decide to hash things out at the top of the bell tower, because the bell tower was established earlier in the film.
Well, hash things out. I mean, it's the end.
Well, right. And because they agree they don't want to have a shooting around a bunch of people. So they're already talking about safety, which I think is part of, again, the strange moral code of this movie is, we're going to have a shootout, but we're going to do it where innocents don't get killed.
They both think they know what's going to happen when they get to the top of that tower. I think that Ken hopes maybe a little bit that his monologue to Harry, which is really actually kind of beautiful when
it is,
when you don't think of it as him trying to, squeeze out of his comeuppance. But, he maybe thinks that might work, but honestly, he probably knows that it won't. Because Harry is, kind of a monster. And he's clearly, based on how he's spoken to Harry in the past, especially on the phone, he's seen Harry do horrible things. We don't even have to hear about it to know the look on his face of like, yes, Harry, absolutely, Harry. And
they have a history, like such an unspoken history.
Yeah, I'm sure he's seen Harry commit any number of atrocities on people who upset him briefly. So I think he knows, or thinks he knows, as he's nearing the top of the tower, that's it.
He dressed for it.
You can see his face when he's looking out at the tower, and he really is thinking, if I have to go, I mean...
Oh, he loved the view up there. He established that in the very beginning of the film. He went up there, those 336, give or take, steps, and loved that view. And also, he was ready. He put on his best suit. He was done up. He had dressed for his death. It was an interesting sort of preparation that he'd done. So, which is interesting, kind of counterbalances a way, because when Colin Farrell was getting ready for his date, he was also looking a little snazzy and trying to, it was a kind of interesting little counterbalance there. Yes. But yeah, they go up, they get to the top of the tower, and they have they have a talk. Well, Harry decides to shoot Ken in the leg.
Yeah.
Because he can't manage to quite kill him. Like, he has a soft spot for his favorite hitman.
Well, and Ken said, I owe you everything.
Yeah.
I love you, Harry. And because what would you say to a man who feels so fundamentally unloved and unlovable?
Right.
To a certain degree, to unman him completely. And that was, again, like, as well as he knew Harry, he probably knew it was a desperate gambit, but it did kind of work when he said, I owe you everything. And he put his gun down and he said, what are you doing? Pick that gun back up. I'm going to outdraw you anyway. Pick it back up. He said,
yes.
I'm not going to pick it up, Harry. I'm not going to shoot you. If it has to end here, it has to end here. And it's a lovely, lovely scene.
Mm-hmm.
You almost, in that moment, when Harry shoots him in the leg, think, fuck, this guy maybe has a little bit of humanity.
Yes.
If that did reach him. Of course he's going to shoot him in the leg, like Harry said. I'm not going to not shoot you. I mean, come on,
If Ray had managed to get out of town and not be brought back, if the movie, this would have been a very clean ending to this story. But of course, we're not going to have that, because is it Harry's henchman who then sees Ray down at the little cafe that's sort of at the base of the bell tower. And then more or less shouts up to Harry, lets Harry know, Ray's here, Ray's here. So Harry's starting to race down those tower steps to get down there and take Ray down. And Ken tries to stop him, and Harry responds by shooting him in the neck.
Yeah.
Very bloody moment in that. And of course, Harry runs off, and Ken uses pretty much the last remaining bit of life in him to get back up to the tower and try to warn Ray. Mm-hmm. And here's what I fucking love. This is, again, beautiful screenwriting and something that as a storyteller, I just love little moments like this. So in the very beginning of the film, when he tries to go up that tower to it's €5 for admission to go up into the bell tower, and he tries to pay with coins, but he's like 5 cents short. He's like, well, you just take this, and the guy's like, no, and it forces him to get out his paper money and break that. So he has those coins still on him that he then uses to throw out the window to kind of clear anybody from the base of that tower, so that he then is able to jump and not land on someone.
Yeah.
And he jumps in order to get Ray's attention so that he knows that Harry's there. And it's just like such amazing poetry. Like that whole fucking moment. The very first time I saw this, I was not expecting that. It is brutal. It is gory. It is intense. And it is heart-wrenching.
Yeah, it's a bit like the ending of Shakespearean tragedy, but bent slightly into the farcical.
Yes.
It's a weird vibe of, again, there's a lot for a movie that really is not particularly violent or bloody. That ending is just awash in a ridiculous amount of gore. Which
I mean, doesn't McDonagh have a way of like using bloody exclamation points at the end of otherwise benign sentences? It's like, it's a very ungory movie until it's the most intensely gory thing you've ever seen.
And a bit with the next one too, in terms of just like, when it turns the corner, it really turns the corner. And I can see how a lot of audience members would be turned off by that. That's a very brave choice to make.
It is.
In terms of, again, just the strange and unlikely things all seeming to conspire the way that they do. And I don't mean just make it sound like this movie is predictable, because it's really not at all. But right. I will say that earlier in the movie, when we saw the dwarf in the schoolboy outfit, after hearing Harry's speech, I was jumping up and down in my seat like, I know it's going to happen. He's going to kill the dwarf and think he killed a kid and kill himself.
Oh, my God.
I was so happy.
You are diabolical, and I love you. That's great. I miss shit like that on a first-time watch. And since on my rewatch, of course, I already knew. Well, I had forgotten, actually. I had forgotten most of the plot of the movie because it had been that long since I'd seen it. So after when I saw the dwarf in the outfit, and when I remembered Harry's line, I did kind of the same thing. I'm like, oh, fuck, he's going to think it's a little boy.
What possible reason could there be for that actor to be put in that outfit at that point in the movie? And I was just, again, so happy to be proven right, because it was just, that's a wonderful.
Well, it's just like, the stories that, again, poetry, it rhymes. To quote the great George Lucas, as you did. When we get to that point, so Harry and Ray, Harry's trying to chase down Ray to shoot him, take him out. There's a bunch of shit that happens. I'm skipping over a lot of things, but eventually this chase ends up on the set of the movie where Jimmy, our friend Jimmy, is filming. And like, he's in the schoolboy outfit. Harry's chasing him down, and he catches up to Ray and shoots him multiple times. I mean, he doesn't go easy on him. I mean, bullets are passing through him, getting lodged in him, probably shoots him like 5 or 6 times, all in the trunk region. He doesn't get a headshot. But one of those bullets passes through him and hits our friend Jimmy. And that's when Harry thinks that he killed a child.
The reason that these bullets are not just going into Ray's center mass, but passing through them and causing insane levels of damage.
Yeah.
It's, again, playing cat's cradle with the plot points back to when Harry was picking up the gun.
Yes.
Bullets, and the gun dealer was like, would you like dum-dums? And Harry gets this beautiful look on his face of a housewife who's been offered like chocolates from a box is
Or free Xanax.
I shouldn't, but I will.
Right.
And so those are what's like doing this heinous damage, and that's the reason why it ends up when it hits Jimmy's head, there's no head or face left, and that's
Right.
what sells the best.
Exactly. In fact, there were even little moments of dialogue earlier in the film when they talk about the proportionality of the limbs being like a kid. I mean, there was something like some random throwaway line that occurred to me when they were talking about the body dimensions of him and stuff like that. You could feel McDonagh just placing these lines throughout as foreshadowing clues. So when you do rewatch it, you kind of re-enjoy it. But what was really interesting to me, and again, this completes the redemption arc, because we have 2 redemption arcs. Ken already completed his whenever he sacrificed himself to warn Ray.
Sure.
Ray completes his redemption arc after he shot, and he does crawl over to Jimmy. And one could question his motives in doing that. Does he think it's self-preservation, or is he really crawling after him to comfort him? Because in the very moment that Harry is looking down at this slain little person that he thinks is a child, and he realizes that he has to live up to his own word, because in his own words, he said, if I'd killed a fucking child, I'd shoot myself in the head right away, like right then and there, He realizes what he had said, and he knows what he has to do. And he starts to put the gun in his mouth, and Ray, who's still alive, it tries to stop him and tell him, no, this is not. And then Harry blows his brains out.
You said 2 redemption arcs, but you just described 3 when you really come down to it.
Oh, that is very true. That is very true.
Again, we've just seen, it could have just been a sort of a, this is a continuation of a beautiful friendship moment between Harry and Ken after Harry shot Ken in the leg. That really could have been the end of it. That could have been, well, now we're square. And again, in that moment, we saw Harry was touched in a way that psychopaths generally could not be.
Right.
And so even that moment of the look on Harry's face of just like, well, fuck it. And he puts the gun in his mouth. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't stop. He doesn't wring his hands. He doesn't say, no, but this is different. I mean, and you, as ugly as this character is, this is what I've been saying, from the beginning in terms of moralizing. He is an evil bastard. He's a total monster. And yet at the same time, you got to hand it to him. You got to hand it to him a little bit. That when that moment came, he did what he thought was the absolute right thing to do.
Yeah, and he even said, you got to stand by your principles.
Not stand by your principles. You got nothing but your principles. And,
exactly.
So even he, who's, still has his redemption arc in a strange way.
Very, very much. It's an interesting sort of redemption triangle when you think about it that way. And the fact that even at the very end of it, Ray tried to intercede in some way. I mean, he wasn't going to be able to, but you would think that a lesser person, possibly, maybe, I don't know, wouldn't have done anything. It would have been like, yeah, shoot yourself. I don't care.
Well, it's like the thing with Ken in the park. It's a matter of moments. It's a matter of inches. If he'd had 2 more seconds to think about it, he'd have said to himself, oh, wait, what am I doing? Go, by all means. And probably Ken would have done the same if he'd stopped for a second and had a moment to think about it. But these guys just went with their gut instinct, which at that moment was, don't let somebody kill themselves. Which, as you said, there's a lot of Catholicism tied into it.
Yeah, and and that also, speaks a lot to the sort of Irish existence, right? That sort of battle between Catholicism and Protestantism and what have you.
Well, and the battle between Catholicism and deep, horrific levels of self-hatred and depression.
Oh, God, 100%.
Find a nickel for every hardened Catholic I knew who, were it not for that, would have ended it years ago. I mean, shit,
I do want to ask, because I think this is almost a litmus test for our own personalities here. But how do you interpret the ending of this one? Because it's a little ambiguous, but not, I mean, I don't think it is, but depending on your outlook, maybe you do think it is.
Ambiguity is McDonagh's bag. And again, I think that trying to sum up neatly anything that he does is a mistake. So I think that, again, the way that it sort of exists outside of traditional concerns of morality, a lot of things you can't put like your own neat interpretation of. It just sort of exists.
Right. I mean, that's a very good point, and I think that's the beauty of it.
So, yeah, he ends things with a question pretty much every time.
Yeah, we'll maybe attempt to answer that question in a different way for the next film. For this one, I do feel like I need to feel, I guess, for my own whatever, that there is a more hopeful ending for this one for him. But even if it doesn't end, like if he didn't live, I think that that's an equally powerful message. I feel like that's the beauty of the ambiguity. It has to work regardless of whatever your choice or preference may be. It makes sense. If you decide to take a more optimistic view or a more pessimistic view, it works either way.
I mean, if you're rooting for him to live, part of you almost has to ask yourself why.
Right. What's coming next for him?
For somebody like this. Like, I mean, in a weird way, if it ends there, it almost seems like a fitting end in his own mind for himself as well, because then he won't have killed himself, but he still will get the ending that he wanted to.
And imagine too that anybody having to carry around that type of mantle of guilt that he's going to have, that's many, many years and most of his life trying to reconcile that against everything else. It's almost like, there's still a redemption whether he lives or dies, but if he dies, that's a closed redemption arc. And that's fine. If he lives, I mean, he can fuck that up, pretty goddamn easily. Ruin all that karmic goodwill.
Well, if he lives, he probably ends up, I would think, in prison for the rest of his life. He was just involved in an extreme shootout. He's probably got warrants on him back home. I mean, he's not going anywhere if he does.
God damn it. You're so convincing.
Thank you. But I agree with you. Like, if the curtain goes, and I love that we don't know. Because again, the worst thing, as my mentor Ron Falzone said in film school, when the closing credits roll on your film, the worst thing that, I don't care if they're booing or jeering or hissing or what, but the worst thing a person in the audience can do is turn to the person next to them and say, "So where are we going for dinner?" Because there has to be a question of what happened next. Things that bundle up neatly and they're resolved tightly, and it's just, it doesn't challenge you.
Oh, I love it. That wraps that up beautifully. And honestly, for a debut film, I'm just going to say, I don't think you could do any better. If this is the first movie you ever make as a feature film, Martin McDonagh had won an Oscar for a short film a few years before he made this one. I think it's called Shoot It Out or Shoot 'Em Up or something like that. But he had built his career on the stage. But then he made that short film, and he always said that he had a filmmaker's heart. He always preferred film to stage. Actually, that's another thing that makes him particularly controversial, is because he writes these amazing plays, but he has himself admitted that he doesn't have as much respect for the medium.
Sometimes you have to start there to get somewhere else.
Exactly. And that's pretty much how he says it. He's like, the way he sees film as more of a three-dimensional, and it is. It definitely is more of a dimensional medium in general, because you're able to go more places and do more things than you can on a stage. So obviously it's going to lack, but he obviously brought the right sensibilities with him from his playwright's toolbox to apply to filmmaking. He's made a couple more movies between In Bruges and Banshees of Inisherin, we've already mentioned. But those two middle films, I feel like, had gotten more mixed reviews than what we're seeing here with In Bruges and then Banshees. He reunites Brendan Gleeson and Colin Farrell. And those two had agreed to be in this film many years before it was ever greenlit. So that's how you have some respect, is when the guys that you were with from the very beginning are like, oh, hell yeah, we're coming back to make another movie. Let's do it. So what was intended to be a double feature with Martin McDonagh's films In Bruges and The Banshees of Inisherin is now going to be two separate episodes, because as Josh and I started talking, we both realized that both of these films deserve to stand on their own. And we hope you'll come back next week for the Banshees discussion. It's going to be fantastic, I promise you. In the meantime, if you have any questions, concerns, or thoughts on In Bruges or anything else that we've discussed, please feel free to reach out to me at dddarknesstime@gmail.com. You can also leave a 5-star review over on iTunes or Apple. That would be most appreciated. And thank you so much again to all the fans over on Patreon who are supporting the show, getting ad-free episodes and some other peeks behind the scenes. I'll be back again next week. We'll see you then. This episode was produced by yours truly, Allison Dixon, and wouldn't be possible without the amazing contributions of countless friends, family, and Patreon supporters. Big shouts also go out to Nathaniel Dixon for all the show art, as well as Spencer Morlock and Ken Dixon for the music. I'll be back with something new next week. In the meantime, you know what to do. Be good, you little ding-dongs.